from a harder lockdown. Alcohol sales suspended immediately, saying that every bed is now needed, suggesting earlier that there is a problem, and we've heard that in reports this week, that doctors are having to turn people away. There are health facilities that are just chock-a-block at the moment, and a curfew between 9 p.m. and 4 a.m. that kicks in tomorrow. So you're not allowed to be out and about unless you're working or seeking medical attention, things like that. Let's get some analysis. We have Professor Richard Calland with us, political analyst via Skype. Professor, your overall opinion on this address tonight?
Well, I think this is probably the most awkward and difficult moment of this whole crisis for the government and for President Ramaphosa. It was always going to be a difficult moment because the country is, on the one hand, opening up the economy, trying desperately to restore some kind of normality to life and to the economy and to business and employment. But on the other hand, is facing this surge in infections and illness, which is causing, of course, great danger to life. So this was always going to be an acute dilemma, an acute moment. And really, the government faces very few choices here. I've worked throughout this period on the assumption that there would be no return to a tough, hard lockdown, because once the genie's out of the bottle, once you start to open up the economy, it's very hard to put it back in. What the president therefore did tonight was to say, well, we remain at level 3, but there are a number of areas, key areas, curfew, alcohol sales, certain gatherings, and the wearing of masks, to name 4, where we have to make a tactical adjustment, where we have to return to greater restriction. Now, I think that's the right approach. The so-called risk-adjusted strategy that was set in place, 2 months ago now, was always supposed to be it was always supposed to be able to respond to the particular context. And what the government was trying to do tonight was, on the one hand, reassure people that there is a plan, and secondly, responding to the particular moment that the country faces.
Yeah. This backs up what the health minister was saying after those first 3 crucial weeks of the hard lockdown, that further hard lockdowns wouldn't yield that much benefit in terms of health, in terms of the infection rate. He says that's the advice that he received. So if there had been a harder lockdown, that would have been political pressure. Do you think the president had to fend off a lot of political pressure to decide that the economy will remain open?
Look, there are competing ideologies, there are competing worldviews, even within the cabinet, never mind in wider society. There are contests between so-called lives on the one hand and livelihoods on the other. Is a zero-sum game, and of course it's much more complex than that. What government has to do is find a way of managing 2 sets of risks. On the one hand, risks associated with the public healthcare crisis and the pressure on the healthcare system. And what the president said tonight was that the country is struggling to cope. He was quite frank about that. But on the other hand, he was very, I think, careful to defend his government's record and to convince people that they had not wasted the 2 months of the hard lockdown, because the whole purpose of that initial strategy was not to in any way contain or eliminate the virus. That was always impossible. What the 2 months of hard lockdown was supposed to achieve was to give government time to put in place the measures in the healthcare system to enable it to cope when the surge in infections happen. Now, clearly in some parts of the country that isn't happening, that the government isn't able to defend the healthcare system, as it were. It hasn't been able to put in place the extra capacity, and so people are suffering very badly. That's very clear. But all this does is show a real spotlight. It shines a spotlight on the structural conditions that this country faces, which is one of great inequality, where public health care and other services are often inadequately resourced, inadequately capacitated, and inadequately managed. And often corruption gets in the way, of course. What I hope is, and the government is obviously beginning to turn its attention to this once the crisis passes, is that post the COVID, people will recognize that this is unsustainable, that a more resilient public service must be put in place. Clearly, at the moment, people don't want to listen to that. They just want to survive the current crisis. What the government did today was to adapt its strategy and say, well, look, We can't continue to sell alcohol. We can't take certain risks. We can't have people out late at night. And we need people to wear masks in public.
So, Professor, you've outlined that this was a bit of a balancing act, and we spoke about all those pressures. There are so many people with opinions, a lot of the opposition parties pushing in different directions, like you said, within cabinet as well. I guess the president has had to, throughout this, show that he's putting the country first, that actions are taken are not party political interests. It's about South Africa. Do you think he succeeded in convincing the nation that has been his priority?
Well, I think you're asking me about leadership and you're asking me about the politics of a crisis. And what a crisis such as a pandemic like COVID-19 does is expose the weaknesses and the strengths of the political system and indeed of the government and its leadership. So on the one hand, I think Ramaphosa has been very decisive. I think he's been very clear in his messaging. I think every single time he's addressed the nation, he's been reassuring, he's been clear, he's been essentially very honest and transparent about the crisis and the nature of that crisis. On the other hand, his style is to govern through a collective and through cabinet. And unfortunately, that has enabled the weak links and what I would call the kind of ideological iconoclasts or mischief makers, even within cabinet, to really run with the ball in a way that has at times been unhelpful. So the cabinet, I think, at times pulls and pushes in different directions, and you have inconsistency. You have an education minister who wants to open up schooling and who is determined to finish the academic year, potentially increasing the risk of transmissions. Meanwhile, the health minister and the Minister for Cooperative Governance, of course, wants to limit risk by, for example, limiting the sales of alcohol or cigarette sales and so on. So at times it seems to me the Cabinet doesn't speak with one voice, it doesn't have one single policy. And that perhaps, I think, points to a weakness in Ramaphosa's leadership, which is, in the end, his job is to make sure his cabinet does speak with one voice, the policy is clear, and it is coherent.
Professor Richard Callan, please stay with us. We'd like to continue analysing with you, but let's just get some quick reaction from the political parties. ANC's national spokesperson, Pule Mabe, is on the line. Mr. Mabe, your reaction tonight?
Well, evening and evening to your viewers. Well, we do welcome the announcement made by the President. And of course, the sweeping call that all of us must take personal responsibility to be able to fight this pandemic. The number of measures that have been announced by government today do indeed reflect a greater commitment on the part of our government to be able to work with the rest of South Africa's people to fight this pandemic, making sure that there is an imposed ban on the sale and distribution of alcohol and all other things, but also making sure that even within our own public transport settings, there is levels of adherence and making it mandatory for people to wear cloth masks when they go out in the public. It is quite critical that South Africans are made to take personal responsibility. We cannot leave this work only to government. It requires all of us to work together so that the interventions that government is making could be able to produce the desired result.
Mr.
Government
Mabe
cannot be alone in this one.
Mr. Mabe, you mentioned public transport, and the President spoke about the 70% occupancy rate again.
Yes.
But we know that taxis are full right now. Isn't this pointing to perhaps a weakness of ANC governance for years? Many of these taxi riders are saying that they have no alternative. We don't have the public transport system that needs to be in place.
Well, I'm sure that the public transport operators themselves have seen the kind of havoc that this pandemic is causing to our people. And I'm sure that taxi operators themselves now know someone who has passed on because of the coronavirus. Because this pandemic has got an address. It has got people we know in our leadership structures, in our communities where we live. It cannot be that when government takes measures to protect lives, you find that other settings go the opposite direction. When we do that, it effectively reflects upon us on not wanting to save lives. Now, we are all expected, including public transport operators, to work with government to find a solution. We are not going to be able to put commercial interest before the protection of lives of the people of this country. And this message has been coming out clear, and I'm sure that all of us have seen what has happened. Let me just tell you, just to share an experience. For the first time in the history of the African National Congress, this past week, we have issued more statements pronouncing on comrades or leaders who have passed on. We've issued one on Queen Noloyiso. We've issued one on the MEC of cooperative governance in the Northwest. We've issued one on the spokesperson of the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal. Today, again, we learned of the passing of the Speaker of Buffalo City. How many more must die for us to see the seriousness of this pandemic? We need to all stand together, support the efforts of government so that we can defeat this pandemic. We must support the work of the National Coronavirus Command Council and what the President has pronounced today. I do not think that these are punitive measures meant to frustrate South Africans, but these are measures taken by government to make sure that when we wake up again tomorrow, we could still have a country to call home.
All right, thank you very much, Pule Mabe, ANC spokesperson. For more reaction on the President's speech, we now have DA leader John Steenhuisen on the line. Mr. Steenhuisen, are you there?
Yes, I am, Francis. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you this evening.
Great. Your reaction to what the President said tonight?
Well, I thought that we saw a President who was absolutely determined to avoid taking responsibility and has now sought to pass the blame to the very citizens that he's entrusted to protect. I mean, to blame citizens for not having masks, and we provided them a plan where people could have 3 masks each provided by government. And I think what we've seen tonight is the reintroduction of the alcohol ban and nighttime curfew and the limitation of movement between provinces. This is a classic bait and switch to distract South Africans from the real question that we should be asking this evening. And that is, why after one of the hardest and longest lockdowns in the world is our health system still not prepared to meet the crisis? Why do we still not have field hospitals? Why do we still not have oxygen cylinders? Why do we still not have proper beds that can take in patients? And that's a question South Africans really should be asking this evening. It's not good enough for the President to blame South Africans. His government had a long lockdown, and what we should have been preparing for was for the spike that we knew was coming. We knew this was going to happen.
Mr. Steenhuisen, was it ever possible to really prepare for this sort of crisis in a 3-week period?
Absolutely. We did it in the Western Cape. In the Western Cape, you've got the Cape Town International Convention Centre that has beds. You've got beds at Brackenfell. There's no shortage of ICU beds in the Western Cape. And what you do see now is pictures that are emerging out of KwaZulu-Natal, where you have a tent that is costing 80,000 Rand a day with no facilities in it. You've got a Gauteng so-called field hospital at Nasrec where there is no oxygen. This is not what you call preparation. This is obfuscation. And I think those are the questions that we should be asking this evening. Why, after the longest, hardest lockdown, do we still not have the correct preparation? And why is the ball now being put in citizens' court when government has more than ample time to have prepared for all these shortages and to meet these risks? We've done it in the Western Cape. The numbers are coming down. There's been no shortage of ICU beds. Nobody who's needed a bed has not got one. It is absolutely possible, but it requires political will and ensuring that your finances follow the function to ensure that the money goes to where it's needed.
All right, dear leader John Steenhuisen, thank you very much. Let's go back to our political analyst, Richard Calland, on the line. Richard, can I pick up something that I was talking to Pule Mabe about? The elephant in the room may be the fact that health experts have said that taxis are a huge risk. So the President tonight saying 70% occupancy rate, but we know that those taxis are riding full. And when we talk about leadership in this battle with the taxi industry, it seems like government has come up short.
Francis, thank you. I remember very early on in this crisis, back in March, feeling that one of the weak links for South Africa would be its public transport system, or rather its lack of a decent public transport system. And so what you've got at the moment is well-intended government policy, some of which is working, some of which hasn't worked very well because of structural weaknesses in the state and because of corruption in some cases. On the other hand, you've got the socioeconomic realities of this country, which means that it's very difficult for a taxi firm to accept a 70% rule, for example, on occupancy of taxis. So you've got the well-intended policy, probably well thought through, of government, up against the hard rock of the socioeconomic conditions of the country and the lack of capacity in some parts of the country in terms of the state and the ability of the administration to implement policy. And that was always the case. What the crisis does is simply expose those weaknesses to deadly effect, because as a result, people can lose their lives.
All right, thank you. Please stay with us. Professor, we have FF Plus leader Dr. Peter Groenewald on the line. Your reaction, Doctor, to tonight's address?
Well, firstly, our main question is what steps are going to be taken to enforce these regulations? I mean, the President actually admitted tonight that they have a problem in the enforcing of the restrictions. And therefore, we would like to know what steps they are going to take. And we also say we're also dealing with another irrationality. For instance, the banning of the sale and the distribution of alcohol. And now we have a curfew. The question is, shouldn't it be the other way around? If taverns are a real problem, then one should expect that, yes, you can have the sale of alcohol, but have a curfew to prevent that people gather together at taverns. We also say that it is also clear that the management of the health services lack a real proper management. If we take the corruption that prevails with the COVID-19 and the allocations, we in the Freedom Front Plus say that they should have ensured that there is no corruption, and they could have used that money to ensure that there are more beds available and to ensure that the health services are properly prepared. Because I know that this is going to happen. That's why we had a 21 days lockdown in the beginning, to give some time to the health services to prepare for the peak. And they knew that the peak is going to be in July, August and September. And therefore the Freedom Front Plus say that we are not satisfied. And again, there are uncertainties. For instance, the fact that they say the distribution of alcohol, does that include that you cannot export alcohol? We will first to see what the real regulations are in the end to have clarity again. So we are back to square one.
All right. FF Plus leader Peter Groenewald, thank you for joining us. Professor Calland with us via Skype, analysing tonight's address by the President. Professor, you were saying earlier that there's been a lack of one voice. So while the President seems to have been acting on behalf of South Africans, he's admitted, I think in a previous speech, that there has been contradictions in government's response. Are we moving to greater unity among those cabinet ministers, or do you still think that is a weakness? And how could it have been handled differently? I mean, should he be the crisis leader, addressing press conferences like many have called for, making the major announcements, and maybe those ministers only coming in as and when needed?
Well, Francis, as I said earlier, the style of Ramaphosa in general, and again through this crisis, has been to give his cabinet ministers the space and the authority to do their job. And that's worked well in some cases. And I think here of the Minister for Health, Mkhize, DTI Minister Patel, one or two others who have clearly risen to the challenge and who have worked extremely hard and with great clarity of purpose and thought, I think, to serve the nation. Others, unfortunately, and I'm thinking now of the Police Minister, Becky Cele, have perhaps failed to ensure that the ministry that they're responsible for, the police in his case, have executed their mandate, which is to comply, to insist on compliance of rules and regulations with the appropriate level of discretion and light touch as opposed to kind of a heavy-handed approach. Now, of course, all of this is very, very difficult. None of us should pretend that this is an easy situation. Governments throughout the world have struggled to find the right balance, have struggled to put in place the right measures to manage competing risks. So we have to keep a sense of perspective here. However, the weak links in the government, the weak links in the state and its administration have been exposed. What I find it quite ironic from some of the earlier comments from political spokespeople for parties is that, for example, Mr. Steenhuisen, who usually wants to remove government and allow people freedom and liberty, in fact, seems to be saying that government should be imposing itself more on citizens and not giving them responsibility. In the end, actually, every government throughout the world, pretty much everyone that I know, has ended up saying that personal hygiene, personal safety, personal compliance with the rules of the game is essential. That government can't literally make you wear a mask. It can create rules, but in the end, you have to follow the rules. It's a matter of personal choice. Yeah. Now, in the end, when you restrict freedoms, when you make people do things they don't want to do, you need a level of consent. That requires clear communications, it requires unity, and it requires good leadership. At times, Ramaphosa has delivered that. At other times, perhaps he hasn't.
So maybe you can quickly analyze how the DA has behaved as an opposition party here. You're right, the tone has changed. Earlier, they were taking government to court, saying that this National Coronavirus Command Council is simply undemocratic. But we've seen government winning a few cases in the courts. Does that show up the DA, its response, I guess, in the time of COVID-19?
Well, I think opposition parties throughout the world have struggled. They always struggle at a time of national crisis because the spotlight is inevitably on government, it's inevitably on the president, the head of government. And so opposition parties really struggle to get back into the limelight. Either then they have to choose to play the long game and to prepare themselves for what I call the peace and forget about winning the war, or they panic, as I think the DA did, and then jostle for attention. And we saw that a couple of months ago when they went from being proponents of a smart lockdown, pretty much what the government was doing, to being proponents of an exit from the lockdown. And I think that came across as being callous at the time. It seemed that they were more concerned with profit and business than they were people and lives. They seem to backtrack from that, and they're trying to find a better balance now. But I think it's very difficult for them. The ANC, on the other hand, I think has to recognise that many of the faults in government are due to failures of the ANC to ensure that colleagues and comrades throughout the country stick by the rules themselves and are in service of government and do not loot the state. I mean, one of the problems, as the FFF just said, is that corruption and the weakness in the state in delivering public services often undermined by a lack of accountability, a lack of transparency, and a lack of service delivery due to corruption. All of those weaknesses, regardless of how well the president leads, however well the policy is set out by cabinet, those weaknesses will be exposed and are being exposed at this time.
All right, Professor Callan, please stay with us. We continue to get political reaction to the president's speech as well tonight. The IFP's Mkhuleko Hlengwa joins me now for his party's reaction. Mr. Hlengwa, what did you think?
Well, thank you very much, Francis. Good evening to you and the viewers. I think at the outset, the president needs our fullest support when he speaks about national discipline and South Africans actually taking seriously the very grave realities of COVID-19 and the need for all of us to adhere to the basic prescripts and tenets of personal hygiene and maintaining the protocols. Having said that, the president, of course, in his policy outlook and the regulations need to walk that talk. Amongst other things, the fact that he said absolutely nothing about the opening of schools remains a fundamental concern to the IFP, because the plan of basic education has been one of confusion and uncertainty, and that is causing a great deal of societal anxiety, particularly to children who do not know whether they are coming or going, being prepped for school and then not going back to school. That heightens the fear and it heightens the anxiety. So the whole manner in which basic education has been handled has been a missed opportunity tonight by the president when he omitted to speak about that. Secondly, on the issue of the transportation of South Africans, the fact that we are now going to allow 100% occupancy in taxis for short distances. Grants are against the grain of physical distancing. If you've been in a taxi, you'll know exactly what that is. And so there has to be a new dialogue between government and the taxi industry to be able to rationalize with each other about the seriousness of this pandemic, and we are calling on the taxi industry and government to come back to the table and discuss this more seriously. The other area of concern is about the provision of water, which continues to be a fundamental challenge, particularly in the rural communities, and we fundamentally believe that the president will need to crack the whip in ensuring that, amongst other things, you deal with the corruption which has characterized that particular space, because it is very clear that there is an increase in the mismanagement of funds, and we certainly believe that the president has done well to actually ban alcohol with immediate effect, but at the same time we believe that the president must consider very seriously going back to lockdown level 4 in light of the projections that he is giving to give government the space and time to end consultations to take place for planning for a better management of this pandemic. But as things stand now, the IFP remains fundamentally concerned that government is in sixes and sevens about its own policy and regulation outlook.
All right, thank you very much, the IFP's Mkhuleko Hlengwa. We have on the line COPE spokesperson Dennis Blum. Mr. Blum, your response to the president's address tonight.
No, we are saying as the Congress of the People, we must never politicize coronavirus. All of us must work together to fight this dangerous enemy. It is not correct. It is a health matter, and we must leave it with the experts to give us guidance on this. When it comes to the ban of alcohol, we were all the time saying that what the experts are saying, we will follow and abide by that. When the experts have now come up and say, let's ban the sale and distribution, we will follow. And I think it is a correct decision. But we are also not happy. It's a contradiction with the 100% loading of the taxis, because it is an irresponsible decision there. How can you fight the coronavirus this side by banning the alcohol, and you are allowing 100% taxis? It's a very dangerous thing.
They're not allowing that. The president spoke of the 70% occupancy rate, but we know that that's not happening in practice. What would you expect government to do in this battle, which it is, with the taxi industry?
No, the president have said for long distance it's 70%. For local it's 100%. But people must wear their masks. That's why we are saying it's an irresponsible decision. We cannot agree with that. What we are saying and asking, where is the relief fund? A government must give the taxi industry their quota of the relief fund. And we are asking, why is it so difficult to subsidize the taxi industry? It is not the fault of the taxi owners or the taxi industry to cry, but they are correct to say all buses, trains and everything are being subsidized, but they are not subsidized. Now people's lives are being put into danger with this 100% loading of taxis. It is very dangerous, and we are saying it can't happen. The government must review that decision.
All right, not happy with taxi loading capacity there. We were speaking to various political parties and the EFF. We did ask for their reaction. They said they will be releasing a statement later. We now have on the line UDM leader General Bantu Holomisa. General, your response to the address tonight?
We have taken note of the president's briefing. It is clear that we are caught up in the middle of the battle. And whatever step one takes, either sideways, backwards or front, you are being fired left and right. But what I've detected from his speech is that he seemed to be blaming the community or the people of South Africa, that they are not listening. At the same time, he is also telling us that the hospitals of this country's state of readiness, he is not there. He is still saying we are going to do A, B, C, D, E. I'm also surprised that he couldn't say a word about the funds which are being embezzled from Corona on this Corona period. And I hope that in his next appearance on TV, tell us what steps have been taken. Lastly, the issue of the 500 billion rands which was set aside, the government must tell us which companies have been rescued, which institutions have benefited out of that, because you can't risk the lives of the people and expose them to say, here is a taxi, 100% between Joburg and Soweto, Pretoria, and so on. Yet, you had announced that you have 500 billion to protect the health of South Africans as well as to help those businesses. What happened to this money?
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, UDM Leader General Bantu Holomisa. And let's go back to Professor Richard Calland. And maybe we should talk about the taxis. Again, this comes up over and over. So to clarify, it's 100% capacity allowed with masks on for local travel, a long distance, 70% occupancy rates. Is this capitulation of leadership in the face of a very strong taxi industry in South Africa that has allowed to become very strong over time?
Pandemics are highly political. Political crises of this sort are, by definition, highly political. If one goes back 100 years to one of the most famous early statements of what politics is about, it's who gets what, when, and how. And at a time of national crisis, the question of who gets what, when, and how is absolutely at the center of government policy. It's at the center of the national crisis that we all face. So when Mr. Bloem from COPE says that it's purely a medical thing, it should be left to the medical experts, I'm afraid he's naive in that sense. It is highly political. And so therefore, when Mr. Klengwa from the IFP says, actually, you need to get competing stakeholders or interest holders, I should say, together to negotiate an appropriate way forward, he's absolutely right. And I thought his suggestion about how the taxi industry and government should be doing more to find agreement on the way forward is absolutely right. And this is where the money, the economic recovery side of things, touches sides with the healthcare and the public risk management side of the governance challenge. In other words, if you are asking an industry such as the taxi industry to reduce its occupancy, you have to compensate them, and you have to make it clear how and when you are going to compensate them. Otherwise, it's very unlikely they will comply, and their power, their muscle, and the socioeconomic reality that I referred to earlier is likely to prevail. So we need more of that. And the government's had plenty of time now. It's 4 months or so into this crisis. And I would have expected that sort of agreement between key sectors and the government should have been reached.
The IFP also raised the fact that there was no mention of schools. And of course, this has been a very hard issue. Reports over the last week of young children dying, obviously adding to the concern of parents. And we were talking about government being successful in the courts, but in a not so successful case, early childhood development centres have been ordered to be open because there was no real plan. Is this sort of a missing but crucial element he should have touched on?
I'm surprised he didn't deal with it, because it's a very complex and very delicate part of the overall jigsaw puzzle. And it's an area where, unfortunately, South Africa can't learn much from other countries or indeed from the emerging science, because there is no emerging clarity of science in relation to this particular problem. Whereas in other areas of the world, in terms of governance and policy, some kind of consensus has emerged as to how best to deal with the problem. When it comes to schooling, the science is not clear. It's not entirely clear whether children, for example, are big transmitters or whether they are particularly strong in terms of their immunity system. And so, therefore, the facts are not perhaps clear. What that suggests, therefore, is that perhaps one should tread carefully, that one should take a very careful and very risk-averse approach to schooling. Instead of which, the Minister for Basic Education, Angie Motshekga, has pressed on, saying, no, education must continue, children must get back to school and the academic year must be completed. Now, this is where the Cabinet, I think, is inconsistent. As I said earlier, there are different approaches to different risks across Cabinet, and this is where I think the President has perhaps failed to ensure that there is one consistent policy in terms of managing the different risks. Overall, Ramaphosa has done, I think, an extraordinary job. You compare him with many leaders around the world. And tonight, again, I thought he was absolutely clear. His analysis of the problem was extremely good. But there is, unfortunately, in this country, in South Africa, as ever, a gap between the well-intended policies and the purpose of Cabinet and the delivery and the ability of the state to execute well-intended policy.
All right, so if we focus on the good for a little bit, I do think, and tell me if you agree, that there was a degree of transparency also around what's expected now in terms of the infections and deaths. So he said that 40,000 to 50,000 people may die by the end of the year. That's a prediction, but we should try and, thwart that prediction. At least is government being clear now, because it was very open. The health minister praised for being very open in the beginning. And then there were complaints that the modelling that government was using was not being widely opened up to other experts. Do you think this is a return to transparency, even mentioning the number of people who will die?
Francis, as a leader takes his country through a crisis such as this, it is essential that trust is built and maintained at every step of that journey. I think during the early part of the lockdown and the crisis, the president was very clear and very open, and I think he commanded trust and built consent and compliance. Inevitably, perhaps, over the weeks and months that have followed, partly because of some of the apparent unreasonableness of some of the regulations, even though the government has been able to successfully defend most of them in court, a lot of that trust, a lot of that sense of consent and compliance has unfortunately drained away. So now the government is trying to do several things at once. It's trying to manage a massive public healthcare crisis. It's trying to implement and execute sensible regulations that will allow the economy to slowly reopen and people to regain employment and livelihoods and so on. And also at the same time, rebuild lost trust. It's an impossible task. Let's be realistic about this. We have to keep a sense of perspective here. The country is in the eye of the storm at the moment. I thought the government, the president was very clear about that tonight. And he was basically saying, buckle up. It is going to be a very rough ride for the next couple of months, but you can get through it. And if you look to other places in the world, Italy, for example, in February was literally hell on earth. In a G20 country, people were dying in the corridors or on the streets. The dead were not being buried. The healthcare system was collapsed. Now Italy has bounced back to a very large extent. So I think South Africa will get through this. There's no doubt about that. But it is going to be a bumpy ride. Yeah. Transparency is crucial. Francis.
And what about, you spoke about trust. Would it help if the president spoke more often and took questions from journalists, as journalists often ask for?
I think he is the government's best spokesman. He's the clearest strategist in terms of conveying the strategy, or I should say he's the clearest spokesman in terms of conveying the government strategy. And again, back to his style of leadership, which is to give the ministers their space to lead in their areas of authority. Unfortunately, that has led to mixed messages and perhaps mishaps in terms of both policy and communication. At a time of crisis, all of the textbooks tell you, all of the academic research tells you transparency is critical. You need to explain to people why you're doing certain things, why you're reaching the decisions that you are reaching. You've got to be absolutely clear in terms of communicating what those decisions are and what you expect of people. And you have to be consistent in your messaging. And at times, the government has failed in that. Ramaphosa, on the other hand, he himself, I think, has passed all of those tests. One can sort of give him a series of A+ grades in that respect, which begs the question, why is he not speaking more often to the nation? I think he should be speaking at least once a fortnight, if not more. And now I think is the time that he should be taking questions. And I think his disinclination to take questions is now beginning to look like a weakness. Journalists are upset about it, but I also think that he's missing an opportunity, which is under questioning, to explain better and fully. Because if you look at some of the court affidavits, for example, Minister Patel's affidavit in the Western Cape case of SI, you will see there evidence and detailed account of how the government is reaching its decisions. People don't understand the complexity of this. They perhaps don't understand that at cabinet level, at least, the decision-making is being taken, I think, with great sincerity and with great seriousness. Of course, once again, we come back to the fact that as that decision-making trickles down through the government system, all of the weaknesses of the state, including the prevalence of corruption and embezzlement, as Bantu Holomisa, the general, pointed out a few moments ago, that then becomes the Achilles heel. And again, I think the president has perhaps been weak in not calling certain ministers or certain parts of the country and his government to account, to ensure that that sort of corruption doesn't get in the way of executing good policy at this crucial time.
Well, you've preempted my final question, because, yes, he didn't mention it at all, although he has in the past. But the Auditor General even saying, looking into that big 500 billion stimulus package, and claim after claim, and these were the safety nets for South Africans, the food parcels, the new grants, the UIF. So you think he should have spoken about it more, or should there actually be action? I mean, I don't know. Nobody's been investigated. Nobody's been fired. You spoke about some of his weak ministers. Or is now not the time to start rearranging leadership? That'll come later.
I think when one's talking about political appointments, it's certainly at cabinet level, at the time of the crisis, you don't want to shuffle the pack. You just can't afford the loss of time that takes. You have to stick with your team, hope they'll get through the season, as it were, and then at the end of the season, you then have to call people to account and make changes. And I have no doubt that time will come in due course. Indeed, Francis, one of the things that may happen is that there'll be some sort of public inquiry. I know in many countries around the world, there are already calls, and in some cases, the start of proceedings to ask what happened and why, to try and expose, or not expose, but diagnose the failings that may have cost lives. The South African government may face that. And indeed, if the healthcare system is not up to the task, then, of course, the ANC government will have to account to that. They've been in power since 1994. If the healthcare system, the public healthcare system, is not capable of absorbing a public health crisis like this, then one has to ask why. And I think the inequalities of public service delivery, the inequalities that are structural and deeply rooted in South African society, are being exposed by this crisis. And what one hopes is that people will accept now that something has to change, that there has to be a redistribution of power, authority, and influence in society.
All right, we appreciate your time and that comprehensive analysis of the President's speech. That was Professor Richard Calland. So just a recap, some of the highlights, some of the